Women are extraordinary because of the myriad of experiences we get to live that are unique to us, from giving birth to looking after people. Women hold up half the sky and they do more than their fair share of the work on the planet. I'm always struck by the incredible resilience of women, but also by the fun and humour that we can find in the darkest of situations.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Impact Leaders Series 2. That was Suzanne Legena, the CEO of Plan International Australia, and it's really an honour to welcome Dave Hussey and Sarah Sonata today from Plan International, two expert development leaders, professionals, who we're going to do a deep dive today into not only their work, but what they've seen, and with a specific focus on what's happening in the Horn of Africa. I think Suzanne really shared something powerful around women and girls. We're leading here at Equal Change into International Women's Day, and it'd be great if we could also touch on how crises often impact women and girls disproportionately, especially its effect on girls' education and girls' security. So I think initially, once again, really great to welcome Dave and Sarah with us. I'd just love to begin by asking both of you, where does your passion for social justice come from? Was it a moment, or was it perhaps a series of moments? Sarah, perhaps if we could start with you.
Thanks, Jeremy. I think in my case, I'm originally from Sudan. I was born in Tunisia, and I grew up in a number of other countries. So I really consider myself a global child. But that's affected me in many ways. I think at a very young age, I was exposed to grave inequalities from all these travels I could see. I don't want to be spreading very stereotypical images of people in certain contexts, but from a very young age, I saw these grave inequalities, and I realized that this cannot be right, and just felt the need to come into the space that I am in now and try to achieve more equality. And I think it comes from the fact that I've recognized my privilege at a very young age. And I think we're all born with some privileges. And it's really important to realize that we can use our privileges to empower others, use our privilege to, see power in other places. So, yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
And currently, as the program manager for Plan International, you would be seeing a lot of stories directly in terms of the programs that you run. And I'm curious if I can just dive a little deeper. Was there a particular moment that galvanized this passion for you, where you actually realized there's nothing else you could do but this work? This was the most important thing and place for you to focus your time and energy.
I don't think there's a particular moment per se, but it's really a series of moments. As I said, seeing, as a child, seeing children searching for food through a dumpster. I realized that the only difference between me as a child and that other child is really, the families and the countries that we're born into, things that are completely outside of our control. So for me, it was trying to take charge of the things that are within our control and changing them and adapting them to see more equality across the globe.
It's so true. I often say, we're beneficiaries of the geographic and genetic lottery, right? The fact that we can have the time and space to have this conversation. Dave, what about you? Was it a moment or a series of moments that galvanised that passion for social justice and the work that you're committed to?
Well, thanks, Jeremy. I come from the other end of the continent, from Sarah. So I come from South Africa, and I grew up in a grossly unjust society. Our formal policy was declared a crime against humanity. I don't think you can get much more unjust than that. And so my belief in humanitarianism and belief in social justice actually came in being part of a struggle to overthrow that government and that regime at the time. But then working across Southern Africa in an era of HIV/AIDS, of extreme poverty, of great hunger and challenge in many of the countries where I was working, it was clear that this was a result of I think, a thread of unjust, kind of policies and systems running through, that it was the vulnerable people who were really suffering. And so my belief in humanitarianism and our belief in humanity grew just in terms of working in those environments.
Yeah, you grew up in a period of one of the great long-running crimes against humanity, as you say, apartheid. Again, if I may ask, is there a particular moment that galvanised this for you, that seared itself into your memory?
Well, in the 1980s, and that's going back quite a way, our country was at war. And I had friends and colleagues and so on who really suffered, some who didn't make it through the 1980s and so on. So seeing that level of conflict, repression, but also amazing commitment and bravery from people who can change a system, that was a defining period for me. And then going into the 1990s and early 2000s, seeing amazing colleagues, really committed, absolutely steadfast in their commitment to social justice and to humanitarianism, was really inspiring. And I think many of those people that I worked with and stood alongside during that time still remain an inspiration to me.
So what keeps you going? I mean, we'll dive into this shortly, because you shared earlier that recently you've just returned from Kenya and seen the work, and undoubtedly you see many challenging things and are in difficult circumstances that must move you. What keeps you going every day? What makes this work meaningful and make you further that commitment to give it your life's work?
Well, it's a great question, Jeremy, and I do want to invite in, recognizing the audience that we're talking today, to really two things. One is we do work, many of us in the work that we do have obviously a really strong commitment to social justice in our work. I think we also work to what we would call a humanitarian imperative, is that people who are facing severe threats to their life or their opportunity or so on, it's imperative on us to seek ways to help them as being a member of the human race, as a part of humanity. So I think it's important to remember that humanitarian imperative, as it's called in our work, is incredibly powerful. It's something that we really believe in. It's at the center of what drives us and many of us in our work and opportunities and so on. But the other thing is really a belief that we can make a difference. So much of the work and even the context that we work with, the impact is huge. We talk in nature of millions of people at risk. We see conditions that are extremely challenging. Humanitarian situations involve, severe risk to people. People die in those situations and so on. But we have to believe, and we do believe, that we can make a difference in many different ways in what we do. So in some ways, it's these two things. It's the belief that we can make a difference, and I would invite your audience to say, we can make a difference. Every person can make a difference in terms of this. And the second thing is the imperative. We should be trying to help. We should be trying to meet that humanitarian imperative. These are the two things I would say kind of that drive myself. I can't speak for Sarah, but I do know from many of my colleagues, it's a very similar motivation.
I think that's such a powerful point to make. I had the opportunity 3 years ago with the Plan International team. I was invited to the Rohingya refugee camp and saw that extraordinary commitment and deep expertise of the Plan team, working initially in the WASH, the Water Hygiene Sanitation Program, working to stabilise a highly traumatised community who had been the recipients of what's now been considered a genocide, and it's extraordinary to see that. I think there is, for people working on the ground, most of us wouldn't understand because we haven't perhaps had that experience, but there is a post-traumatic stress disorder, from what I understand, that can occur when people are, the humanitarian workers are experiencing this on a daily basis. Sarah, what about you? What keeps you going, given what you hear and what you experience? I imagine almost on a daily basis in this work.
I think I completely agree with Dave. I think first and foremost, there's that drive that you want to see positive change, and that obligation that you feel towards the world. Especially those in humanitarian settings. But I think one of the biggest motivators for me is really the stories and the power of the stories that I come across on a regular basis. And the best ones are the ones I've experienced firsthand, because we in every report that we get on a quarterly or a monthly basis, we have a section at the end that's basically an interview with one of the people benefiting from the program, and they speak about the impact of this project on their lives. But the best ones are the ones you get to see for yourself. And I'm going to share a story for an incident I had in Cambodia when I was going to visit one of our projects. And I was just at the hotel in my Plan t-shirt, and this young man, about 20 years old or so, comes up to me and says, "Oh, you work for Plan?" And I say yes. And then he says, "Well, I was a sponsored child in this village, and the whole village benefited from Plan." And I was like, "How so?" And he said that ever since he was a child, his school was benefiting from Plan programs and school meals projects. So he was getting hot meals every day at school. He said that his parents were farmers, and Plan programs supported their farming business. And that when he grew up and he was about 18, he took some vocational training courses through Plan and ended up working in the hotel where I was staying. And it was so lovely because it was so unprompted. I was just having a cup of coffee, and this person comes to me with all the excitement in the world. And I've only been working at Plan for, 6 years, I think, in total. And he is talking to me about this great impact it's had on his life. So for us, it could be, a job. For the people we work for and we service, it's really their life.
Isn't that a fantastic story about how one act of generosity creates a ripple in a pond, which is someone's life, which ultimately impacts an entire community? And the stories are incredibly powerful. And is this part of what inspired you to want to work with Plan? And if you could also share, perhaps, Sarah, if I can continue with you asking this specifically, top level, what does Plan do, and what does your job require of you on a daily basis?
Well, 100%. I think the question about what Plan does, it's a big one. So I'm going to leave that to Dave to get into in more detail. But I think I'll get into what Plan does well, and that's working with the communities and building those relationships over many years that our programs are designed and are responsive to every need that we encounter through the community members that we've built this long relationship with. I've worked with other organizations, I've worked with the United Nations, I've worked with multilateral banks, but then I came back to Plan because it's the approach that we work through the communities and all these little bits of puzzle that come together that then, shape the lives of someone like the young man I met in Cambodia, to have such great impact. But maybe Dave, I'll bounce this one over to you.
Yes, I would characterize it, Jeremy, if I jump in there. So Plan is a global organization. We have countries across the world that are focused on supporting children, and particularly girls, in realizing what we would consider to be their life opportunities, their rights to a healthy and a fulfilling life. So how do we do that? Well, we run programs across to make it kind of simple, what we call our our learn, lead, decide, thrive, and survive. So learn education programs. We are really intent on supporting children to go through formal schooling, but also informal schooling, so that they can learn the skills to be able to develop themselves in their lives. Lead, children have power, and young people have power in and of themselves. They have a voice, they have a view on what they want to do in their futures. We want to support them in being able to do that. So often we run programs that are about supporting children's views and voices in different programs that communities or governments or other international organizations might run. So to give you an example, we might have a child-centered approach to disaster risk reduction, where we work with children across communities and schools for them to be able to present what they think the key risks are to them, their families, and their communities, and what we should be doing about them. Those are often very, very powerful programs because children get to see things that adults tend to forget or to gloss over. Decide means that children, young people have a greater say over their own bodies and their own lives, so they get to make decisions that are important for them. Thrive is that they can have a healthy life, and particularly as a young child. So we have health programs and stimulated learning environments that are protective for children, so they are protected in those environments. And then the one that relates to this crisis, I would say, is what we would call survive, and where children and communities very broadly have challenges to their life and to their well-being. We step in and we provide humanitarian support and assistance. So that might be in the form as what we might discuss today, which is in a food crisis, we step in and we address the immediate needs of that crisis. So that would be food and survival needs. So it might be water access, but also protection. If people are displaced, for instance, that they are protected in the areas where they land up, or the communities that are hosting them after a crisis. So that's just in a snapshot. So we have an ambition to reach hundreds of millions of children and girls in our strategy. But we also have, as we said, an imperative and obligation to assist children and communities that are threatened by very significant crises.
I'd like to jump very shortly into the specific crisis that we're here to meet about. Although initially, I note the tagline, the Charity for Girls Equality, behind you, and Plan has been an I Could Change partner now for several years. Given our focus on women and girls empowerment, we've very proudly been able to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for Plan and your girls' education program. Could you articulate why girls specifically? Why is there that focus and the return on impact that it has for communities when there is that that focus on the education and empowerment of women and girls?
So perhaps start off with why girls. Now we recognize that in many of the countries and the communities where we work, girls face particular barriers and particular risks that above and beyond what children or young people in those communities may face. They may face abuse, but they also may face barriers to education that allows them to really develop the skills for a really fulfilling and productive life in their particular communities and so on. So when we look at focusing on girls, we focus on, we really are doing that because of two things. One is particular barriers that girls face, and that it makes them, that is a social injustice in and of itself, because they have unequal access to many of the opportunities that perhaps boys might have in particular situations. And the other one is vulnerability. So it's an equality and a justice issue, but it's also a vulnerability issue. We understand that girls are particularly vulnerable, especially in crisis situations, to particular forms of abuse and neglect in those situations. So we step forward as an organisation, and as you say, Jeremy, with much support from our partners, to be able to try and make a difference in that. So it's not that we don't work with boys or young men; we have to, because they are equally agents of change in achieving equality, and really addressing some of the significant general challenges of a crisis. But we do need to have a very special focus on girls and young women in those particular situations to ensure that we don't carry on or perpetuate the levels of inequality that are in those particular situations. So we bring we bring community programs into play, child-centered community programs, but in doing so, we have a very particular aspect and a way of identifying the particular issues that affect girls, but then also working across those communities, men, women, boys, and girls, to be able to start to address some of those barriers and those inequalities.
Just to highlight that point even further, as we lead into International Women's Day, I think two stark examples, if you look at what's currently happening in Afghanistan as a great tragedy, which is obviously leading the country backward very quickly, compared to, say, Rwanda, where women and girls have largely rebuilt the country after the genocide to become one of the fastest growing economies in the world and one of the most stable economies on the continent. Sari, is there anything, given that you come from that part of the world, that you might like to add to that in respect to the focus on women and girls empowerment?
I just couldn't stress the importance of focusing on girls and women anymore. As Dave said, women are subjected to an additional layer of barriers that is often unseen. And recognizing the power of women and girls to turn things around is also quite important. So we don't only work for them, we also work through them, and we see a lot of the biggest impacts happen when we really engage women and girls. Some of the work we do is around setting up village savings and loans associations. So in those, we tend, our work and our experience, we've got a very strong evidence base to show that when we engage women in these village savings and loans associations, which are basically small groups of women coming together and saving money together, and then taking loans on a regular basis to either spend on what's essential for them or to start their own small startups. And what we have seen in terms of how they spend this money, it almost always goes back into really growing the community at large, because they use it to pay for their children's education, for their children's health, and for their own health as well, and starting up a business that serves the communities where they live. So the ripple effect of such a small activity that's focused on women is really, really high. And it only speaks again to the power of women and girls in enacting this change, this positive change.
I come from a family of strong women, and I'm often reminded if I ever did the wrong thing, I got into trouble very, very quickly, and was then reminded of the extraordinary sort of power and respect which I've been fortunate to grow up and witness from my father, and of course many people are not fortunate to have those role models. Let's jump into the really critical issue at hand here, and just some very brief background. So. In Somalia in 2011, famine claimed the lives of 250,000 people, mostly children. Now, the current crisis in the Horn of Africa, as I understand, is already much worse. Dave and Sarah, I was just reading this morning, and these are stats from UNICEF, that there's currently more than 1.7 million children across Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia that require urgent treatment for severe acute malnutrition. From the World Food Programme just 5 days ago, there's an unprecedented 6th poor rainy season, effectively a drought, that the region is entering into. And this crisis has been exacerbated alongside the conflict, mostly in Ethiopia, inflation, and the war in Afghanistan. So on the ground, Dave, I understand you were there only a few months ago. Can you paint the picture for what's currently happening in the Horn of Africa? And how is Plan responding?
Yes, sure. I mean, those statistics that you mentioned, Jeremy, of course, are extremely daunting. This is a massive crisis in the sense of the scale and the extent across the region. So I'd just like to place that in context as well. There is a global hunger crisis, actually, that involves other countries, that include countries like Haiti, Niger, Burkina Faso, and so on. In the Horn, what we're seeing is the result of what we might call kind of like 5 Cs. So there's been conflict across a number of these countries that have really displaced people, also disrupted supply chains around food. Around that, second C would be climate. We've had climatic impact, so failed production cycles, in some cases, ironically, floods, also destroying kind of productive capacity. But largely speaking, there's been an extended period of drought across a number of countries that are actually adjacent to each other as well. Other Cs might include, for instance, the what we might call commodities. So what we've seen more recently, and this is where Ukraine does have an impact, is commodity prices have made food inaccessible to communities, particularly that are struggling for the basics. So what we've seen is food prices have increased quite dramatically across the region, and we're having difficulties of access. Actually, supply chains are breaking down. So when we say that, what we mean is when you see those news reports about grain coming out of Ukraine, Ukraine is pretty much a breadbasket for many countries. They provide a staple. In many cases, it might be wheat, it's other grains, and so on. The war has disrupted that supply chain, and so what we have is difficulties of access. Other Cs is that COVID, we've got a post-COVID effect in the sense that many of these economies were actually evolving and improving over time. So I do want to address that kind of stereotype perhaps of some of these countries as not being developing countries. Ethiopia, for instance, had a 9% increase in its global national income year on year before COVID, and that has been severely impacted.
We lost Dave there temporarily. So would you like to continue, if you could, on what's currently happening in the region?
Yeah, I think the numbers speak for themselves, Jeremy. I don't want to be repeating this, but you were there at the last webinar we had at Plan International, where we had the country director of Somalia tell a first-hand story that she heard straight from the mouth of the horse, basically. She was speaking to a lady who had to flee the village where she was staying because the village was experiencing famine So that means there was absolutely no food available. So she had to escape with her children, walking for days on end to get to another village where there was a bit of food. And along the way, her 5-year-old daughter died, and she didn't even have the privilege of, staying for a bit to even bury her. They had to keep going because they were running low on energy, and she really needed to save her other children. So such heartbreaking stories. That's one of many, and I couldn't tell. I cannot bring myself to tell the full story because it's just so heartbreaking. It was so hard to listen to it, let alone retell it. So I'm not telling it with all the details, but basically, 5-year-old daughter died. She had to go on without even burying her, just to save the rest of her children. And that's one story. What we're looking at by June 2022 is 345 million people facing acute food insecurity, and that there's no media attention given to that. And I don't want to focus on the negative, because the light at the end of the tunnel is that we are not helpless. It's easy to sit down and look at this crisis of biblical proportions and just feel absolutely and utterly helpless and think, oh, there's nothing I can do about this. This needs top level response. But each person has a role, and no role is ever too small. And there's many ways that all of us as individuals can support in, turning around such an ugly situation to a better one. And I'm happy to talk more at length about this, but I'm aware that we're, I think, running a bit behind on time. So I'll allow you and Dave to.
Thanks, Sarah. That's great. And of course, today is about both educating and inspiring. There's some fantastic retail partners who are listening today, and the opportunity is you could help fund this work through your businesses and choose this new planned project to respond to this crisis, which is largely unheard of. Dave, if I can circle back to you, why does the world not know about this? Why is there such a focus on, arguably, well, correctly, Ukraine, right? There's a lot of other crises, but it seems that there's something intractable about these crises when they occur in Africa, where there's either some unconscious bias or racism at play, and the world just almost thinks it's too hard. Could you, or either of you, speak to that? Because I think this is an opportunity to really raise awareness. What an extraordinary part of the world that is, and this is in a particular area up in the northeast. And perhaps your thoughts on why this has been largely unheeded by the global community.
Yeah, I would say it's a combination of both bias, but also the fact that a crisis like this, Jeremy, unfolds over an extended period of time. I think there's a sense of fatigue, perhaps, from both the media and from the audience that a situation in the Horn, for instance, has been deteriorating for a year and will be deteriorating even further for another year. That's a long time to be tracking, kind of a deterioration in a situation. So I think we see that a lot on what we call protracted or slow emergencies, is that people tend to check in at particular points, but they can't keep an attention span on that over time. Whereas what you might say kind of, sudden onset, spectacular emergencies that happen garner a lot of attention and a lot of media attention as well. So Ukraine has undoubtedly been a focus of the media over the last year. You hardly open up any website or any update from any media outlet on a daily basis, and there will be stories on Ukraine, whereas other protracted emergencies across the world do not get that type of attention. Is there bias? I think there is, to call it out. I think there's definitely a sense in the humanitarian community that it's convenient for media and often maybe Western audiences to perhaps neglect particular types of crises, but perhaps because of a feeling of inability to leverage change, perhaps, or a sense that perhaps those places are further away from us and our lives. So you mentioned Afghanistan earlier. Now, Afghanistan is, by any measure of means, is one of the biggest disasters in the world at the moment. The level of the population facing extreme hardship, and in a sense, the threats to life and well-being, not to mention the threats to girls and women, are extreme, actually, on any scale. But I think that it is perhaps that we might have an element of fatigue or dismay or distance, with those particular emergencies. And it's the same with the Horn. I would say I have spent a lot of time in the Horn of Africa. I've spent a lot of time in Africa. It is a wondrous place, actually. Countries are evolving year on year. As I mentioned before, the economies evolve. These are robust governments, many of them, and so on. But I think there's still a residual perception of Africa, which is that it's a place that struggles continuously. It's not, actually. This is a significant crisis faced by these countries, and these countries have, yes, they do have significant, governance capacity and so on, but the enormity of this crisis is going beyond the governments to be able to respond. And so we do need to enhance, and I really want to pay tribute to you and your audience for bringing this into our terrain. We do need to try to enhance the focus of our public and our networks on this particular crisis. We can make a difference here, but the first thing we have to do is to be aware of it and to appreciate the significance of it and the fact that we can actually make a difference here.
To give some clarity to that significance, are you able to state approximate numbers of people who are either on the brink of famine or even dying on a daily or weekly basis, as per?
Yes, so the numbers across. Sorry, Jeremy. The numbers across the Horn are quite daunting. I think you mentioned some in relation to Somalia. Even as like a powerful country like Kenya, which is a rapidly developing economy and so on, there are over 1.5 million people at threat in particular regions in there. But that pales in significance to the numbers that we see, for instance, in Ethiopia and South Sudan, where you have numbers in excess in each country of 7 to 8 million people who are at risk of food, some impact of the food crisis. Now, that can be multiple forms of impact. So what we've seen in South Sudan, for instance, and in Ethiopia, is an increase in early marriages because of the severity of the impact of the food and impoverishment of particular households and so on. We're seeing a spike, actually, in child marriages as families move to, in a sense, they might move because of protection. They're unable to look after their daughters, in those particular households, or they're desperately trying to find some level of support for members of their household. So we talk in millions. What on the flip side, we do assess situations in terms of intensity. So this is just something I'd like to explain to your audience, which is we talk about scale. So scale would be, we talk about millions of people and children who are at risk when we talk about scale of impact. When we talk about intensity of impact, we actually measure how particular communities or districts or countries are faring in this particular crisis. And people often ask me, what does a famine mean? What does a famine declaration mean? What does it actually kind of entail? Isn't everyone in famine? But we actually have a technical classification system, which sounds terrible when you're talking about things like mortality and so on. But there's a technical classification system. So what we see in these countries is there's a certain level of what we call catastrophe or famine. And that really has three parts to it. food consumption. So what we see is how many households have no access to food. And so when you reach a level of famine, a minimum of 1 to 2 households out of every 5 have no access to food. So that's, you're starting to look at 20 to 40% of households. Then you look at nutritional status. So the impact of a crisis like this is in what we call stunting. So these are in young children, like demonstrable, kind of like, a wasting of the body and deterioration of health. And what we would say there is over 30% of children are demonstrating clear stunting, or wasting in this particular instance. And then there's mortality, which is the worst kind of measure of all. So when you reach a famine level, what you have is in under 5s a death rate of an increasing number of death rate in under 5s. Now you have a general mortality level, but that death rate starts to indicate very high numbers of mortality for children under 5. Now when we see those three coming together, then we know we're in a pre-famine situation or we're on the brink of a famine being declared. And that's what we have in at least 3 countries across the Horn at the moment.
So I just note time, and we do want to open it up to the audience. I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, there are currently thousands of children beginning to die on a weekly basis. Is that the case?
Yes, so estimates globally would be even as high as 10,000 children dying per day of
dying per day
hunger.
in the Horn of Africa.
In that would be globally. I think
Right.
in the Horn of Africa, a good proportion of that total would be in the region.
So we've set up this new project for our retail partners, both new partners and current, to be able to support your work in the Horn of Africa, where $30 can provide life-saving food to ensure children survive, also to keep girls in school where that's possible and appropriate. Let's open it up to the audience. Are there any specific questions that anyone would like to ask? How does Plan choose where to focus their efforts? This is to either Sarah or Dave.
I might just segue on to the previous comments that I made, Jeremy. It's we identify areas of greatest impact and greatest need. So we use obviously kind of like data to be able to do that. We do assessments. We do consultations with governments and humanitarian agencies and so on. We would tend to direct, in most instances, our efforts to the areas of greatest impact. Often we have to negotiate access. So humanitarian situations, particularly in conflict situations, require quite delicate and complicated kind of negotiations with the humanitarian forum in terms of that. But generally speaking, the areas that we choose to go in are areas of highest need.
And respond to that highest need where you see it determined. Any other questions from our audience? That's a great point. We can all make a difference even in just small everyday actions. Thank you for the work you do. That's wonderful to hear from Lolita. Thank you for your work and dedication. It's such an honour to kind of bridge worlds as we are between the business sector and the NGO sector, and hear directly from you. Just before we wrap it up, Sarah, maybe I'll throw this to you. Could you speak of the cluster, helping us understand how does a cluster network work, especially in sort of refugee situations? Again, just to shine a final light on the incredible complexity of the work that you do in stabilising communities, and I think from there we will wrap this up.
The cluster approach simply refers to how we work together, how we work together with other agencies, how we work together with the government, and all together respond to the needs of the communities and the places where we work. So we don't look at every little project on its own, but how all these projects in the different areas, be it food security and providing food, and how that works with also providing cash, supporting with building boreholes and giving access to water, health centers, how all of these work together to meet the needs of the communities that we serve. That's trying to explain it in the simplest terms.
Yeah.
And yeah, hope
No,
that clarifies.
No, that's great. And I think that what that highlights as well is how great NGOs work in partnership.
Yeah.
And they don't want to duplicate effort. And there is a very much that sort of network approach to have the greatest impact. We do have a final question coming in. Does Plan have any programs in place to mitigate the effects of climate change, which exacerbate these issues and inequalities? Thanks, Georgina.
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Yes, why don't you go?
I was going to say yes, we do. Particularly right now with the food assistance programs that we have going on, knowing that most of the food crisis in the places where we work is climate induced and is a direct results of drought. We try to integrate activities that are related to climate change across all of our programs, like providing access to water for irrigation in areas where there's been droughts that affected crops and led to the unavailability of food in some of the places where we work. And we look at that as anticipatory action that will hopefully prevent future droughts along the line. As Jeremy mentioned earlier, the largest famine that Africa has experienced so far was the one that took place in 2011, and that was drought induced. And then the leaders and NGOs and the UN, we all came together and said we're not going to allow for such hunger crisis of the same levels to happen again, and we're going to ensure that there's anticipatory action. But then again, we're in 2023 and we're looking at a very similar crisis of actually frighteningly worse proportions. So at Plan, we're ensuring now that even through our smallest programs, we ensure that it's built in within our programs, that we have some activities that will hopefully shield against these future threats. I don't know, Dave, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Not much, but to say that the powerful, I think, kind of work that I've seen, certainly in my time at Plan, is the child-centered aspect of that. So working with children, really, because as I said earlier in this podcast, it was really just that we see the children bring particular views and they can identify particular risks and the need for change as well. So you'd be amazed at how much of that knowledge actually relates to the sustainability of communities and their production cycles. We don't often credit children with being aware of those particular aspects, but we see it very powerfully in our work when we incorporate children and young people in our disaster preparedness, our risk reduction, but also our climate change adaptation work as well.
Having had the opportunity to see some of your work in the field, it is incredible the complexity of it, and working with communities that are traumatized is a whole other level of difficulty. So I'm in awe of the work you do, and I just want to say thank you so much for what you do and for your time today. You have a lot going on, especially now, and this is undoubtedly a fragile time across the globe. So we will let you go, get back to your life-changing work. But I hope for the audience that's been incredibly informative, and we're really honoured to bring this to our community of retailers to hear directly from experts such as yourself. And we hope this is going to galvanise even more support in the coming weeks and months. So thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to reconnecting again very soon.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Jeremy.
And thank you to everyone who's joined us.